محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها المزمل قم الليل إلا قليلا نصفه أو انقص منه قليلا أو زد عليه ورتل القرآن ترتيلا إن سنلقي عليك قولا ثقيلا إن ناشئة الليل هي أشد وطئا وأقوم قيلا إن لك في النهار سبحا طويلا واذكر اسم ربك وتبتل إليه تبتيلا رب المشرق والمغرب لا إله إلا هو فاتخذه وكيلا واصبر على ما يقولون واهجرهم حجرا جميلا وذرني والمكذبين أولي النعمة ومهلهم قليلا إن لدينا أنكالا وجحيما وطعاما ذا غصة وعذابا أليما يوم ترجف الأرض والجبال وكانت الجبال كثيبا محيلا إنا أرسلنا إليكم رسولا شاهدا عليكم كما أرسلنا إلى فرعون رسولا فعصى فرعون الرسول فأخذناه أخذا وبيلا فكيف تتقون إن كفرتم يوما يجعل الولدان شيبا السماء منفطر به كان وعده مفعولا إن هذه تذكرة فمن شاء اتخذ إلى ربه سبيلا إن ربك يعلم أنك تقوم أدنى من ثلثي الليل ونصفه وثلثه وطائفة من الذين معك والله يقدر الليل والنهار علم أن لن تحصوه فتاب عليكم فاقرؤوا ما تيسر من القرآن علم أن سيكون منكم مرضى وآخرون يضربون في الأرض يبتغون من فضل الله وآخرون يقاتلون في سبيل الله فاقرؤوا ما تيسر منه وأقيموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وأقرضوا الله قرضا حسنا وما نقدموا لأنفسكم من خير تجده عند الله هو خيرا وأعظم أجرا واستغفر الله إن الله غفور رحيم صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها المدثر قم فأنذر وربك فكبر وثيابك فطهر والرجز فاهجر ولا تمنن تستكثر ولربك فاصبر فإذا نقر في النقور فذلك يومئذ يوم عسير على الكافرين غير يسير ذرني ومن خلقت وحيدا وجعلت له مالا ممدودا وبنين شهودا ومحدت له تمهيدا ثم يطمع أن أزيد كلا إنه كان لآياتنا عنيدا سأرهقه صعودا إنه فكر وقدر فقتل كيف قدر ثم قتل كيف قدر ثم نظر ثم عبس وبصر ثم أدبر واستكبر فقال إن هذا إلا سحر يؤثر إن هذا إلا قول البشر سأصله سقر وما أدراك ما سقر لا تبقي ولا تذر لواحة للبشر عليها 19 وما جعلنا أصحاب النار إلا ملائكة وما جعلنا عدتهم إلا فتنة للذين كفروا ليستيقن الذين أوتوا الكتاب ويزداد الذين آمنوا إيمانا ولا يرتاب الذين أوتوا الكتاب والمؤمنون وليقول الذين في قلوبهم مرض والكافرون ماذا أراد الله بهذا مثلا كذلك يضل الله من يشاء ويهدي من يشاء وما يعلم جنود ربك إلا هو وما هي إلا ذكرى للبشر كلا والقمر والليل إذ أدبر والصبح إذا أسفر إنها لإحدى الكبر نذيرا للبشر لمن شاء منكم أن يتقدم أو يتأخر كل نفس بما كسبت رهينة إلا أصحاب اليمين في جنة يتساءلون عن المجرمين ما سلككم في سقر قالوا لم نكن من المصلين ولم نكن نطعم المسكين وكنا نخوض مع الخائضين وكنا نكذب بيوم الدين حتى أتانا اليقين فما تنفعهم شفاعة شافعين فما لهم عن التذكرة مؤرضين كأنهم حمور مستنفرة فرت من قسورة بل يريد كل امرئ منهم أن يؤتى صحفا منشرة كلا بل لا يخافون الآخرة كلا إنه تذكرة فمن شاء ذكره وما يذكرون إلا أن يشاء الله هو أهل التقوى وأهل المغفرة صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد
صلى على محمد وآل محمد. As we wait for Sheikh Jaffari to come, we'll do Dua Imam Zwana together. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم كل وليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وأينا حتى تسكنا وارزقا توا وتمتع فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. صلوات اللهم صل على
For the love of the Holy Prophet Muhammad al-Mustafa, one loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Please open your Qur'ans to the following chapters and to the following ayat. First, you will need from Surah At-Takwir, chapter number 81 of the Holy Quran, verses 8 and 9. And then after that, you will need Surah Al-Fajr, which is chapter number 89 of the Holy Quran, verses 17 onwards. 1-7. If you can have these sets of verses open, it will allow us to be able to have our discussion tonight, inshaAllah. For the love of our fourth holy Imam, Zainul Abidin, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi, let us have a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وقوله الحق: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إذا الشمس كورت وإذا النجوم انكدرت وإذا الجبال سيرت وإذا العشار عطلت وإذا الوحوش حشرت وإذا البحار سجرت وإذا النفوس زوجت وإذا الموءودة سئلت بأي ذنب قتلت. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected scholars, teachers, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. عظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصابنا أبي عبد الله الحسين صلوات الله وسلامه عليه. Continuing on in our series, looking at the topic of how our fourth holy Imam alayhi salam revived Islam after the massacre of Kerbala. In our first discussion, we laid out those narrations that characterized the mentality, the practices, the behaviors of not only the Shia community but the wider Muslim community between the time of our third Imam and our fourth Imam alayhim as-salam. You'll recall the hadith from our sixth holy Imam, Ja'far as-Sadiq salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. The Imam describes the Shia at the time of Imam Sajjad alayhi salam by saying, Hum la ya'rifuna manasika hajjihim wa halalahum wa haramahum. That the Shia did not even know their basics of halal and haram. But through the movement of Imam Sajjad alayhi salam and the movement of Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he says that he took the Shia to such a pedestal where even the awam of the nas, the ordinary wider Muslim community, became reliant upon the Shia to the same extent by which previously the Shia were reliant on the non-Shia. This is an incredible trajectory. How did Imam Sajjad alayhi salam do this? Yesterday, we looked at the opening chapters of the Holy Quran in the Tartib and Nuzuli, in the order of revelation. 10 points. Who remembers what was the first chapter of the Quran to be revealed in the Tartib? Ahsan, Surah Al-Alaq. Ahsant. And what was the second chapter to be revealed in the order of revelation? 20 points. Ahsantum, Surah Al-Qalam. And between Surah Al-Alaq and Surah Al-Qalam, you saw for the first time the normalization of being able to speak against tyranny. Whereas previously, no one dared to be able to speak against the elite of the Quraysh. Now it was normal that the Quran gave the space for people to say, I want to think for myself. I want to believe for myself. And when I see wrong, I will challenge it. One of the first duties of our fourth Imam, Zainul Abidin, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, was to re-normalize this behavior amongst the Muslim Ummah that had become cowardly and afraid at the sword of Banu Umayyah, la'natullahi alayhim ajma'een. You recall yesterday we gave the example of the sermons in Kufa by people like Fatima, the daughter of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. We mentioned the companions, for example, like Zayd bin Arqam, or for example, Anas bin Malik, who would dare now to be able to speak out against the tyrants of the time. Or people like Abdullah ibn Afif that would become the first martyrs after the event of Kerbala. Whom gave this to them? Whom gave them their voice back after Banu Umayyah had all but taken it away from them? Our fourth Imam alayhi salam and his movement, being able to speak out, gave everybody else the impetus to be able to speak out. And of course, as yesterday's conclusion, it shows us that how much of our faith is rooted in the practice of being able to speak against tyranny. Because without that, without the core tenet of Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahi anil Munkar, all of us get swept away by the tyranny of the pharaohs of the time. Tonight, inshaAllah, we want to focus on how Imam Sajjad alayhi salam in the city of Medina al-Munawwara would ensure that the ideology of Banu Umayyah was confronted. A principle in Islamic sociology is that when there is a corruption in society, Islam responds to that corruption relentlessly until the behaviors of people are changed. It does not look at friend and favor. If it sees a corruption, it identifies the logic of that corruption, where it came in, and how we can practically respond to it. In some cases, it needs to be an ethical change. Sometimes it might be an economic change. Sometimes a political change. But wherever those problems come in, Islam doesn't just say, okay, do this, do that. The Quran would reveal ayat after ayat after ayat from different angles of behavior in order to be able to force change in people. And that change was enacted in the behavior of the Holy Prophet Muhammadin al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Understanding this practice, this divine practice of Allah Jalla Jalaluhu, that when He sees a corruption in society, there is an ayah after ayah being revealed. and that the sunnah of the Prophet is to enact that, in the same way Imam Sajjad alayhi salam identified certain corruptions that were plaguing the people of Medina by the oppressions of Banu Umayyah, and was relentless in pushing back against those corruptions. When, through his behaviors, when, through his own example, people saw the difference between how he behaved and the corruption that Banu Umayyah were trying to put in, the people understood the difference between the sunnah of Islam and the sunnah of Banu Umayyah, and then were able to choose which one they wanted. And of course, inshallah, for the majority of them, they wanted to return back to the sunnah of Islam itself. Tonight, inshallah, what we'll show you is this principle from the Quran, that it is relentless. When it sees a corruption, the ayat are revealed one after another to stop it, that the Prophet himself would enact that behavior in order to be able to stop it. And then when we understand the principle, we will demonstrate that example in the personality of our fourth holy Imam, Zainul Abidin, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. Amongst the corruptions and illegitimate behaviors that were prevalent in the pre-Muslim and early Muslim communities was their treatment of children, and particularly young girls. You know very well that they used to bury their daughters alive. You know very well that it was normal to hate upon women and upon girls because the Arabs imagined that they were a burden and a cost. Moreover, because it was a society which was rooted on violence and tribal warfare, it was the behavior and the norm of the Arabs that if one tribe defeated the other, they would take the women and children of the defeated tribe as slaves for themselves, and everything, na'udhu billah, that would follow off the back of that. So it was ingrained within them that there was no value to women, no value to children, except when it was either a boy or it was a means of showing off. One of the great problems of the Arabs was that when they had a bigger tribe with more family members, it was assumed that they were then more powerful. And so the only time having this bigger family was of benefit to them was as a means of pride and arrogance between them and other tribes. Now think about this very carefully as a genuine sociological question. If you were the Prophet, or if you were a young Muslim who has just been brought into a burgeoning faith, genuinely speaking, practically speaking, how do you break that behavior? How do you change the mentality? How do you overturn a culture that is rooted in misogyny, extremism, hatred, belittling of the other? Would it suffice for just one verse to be revealed? No. Multiple, ongoing number of ayats would need to be revealed in various different angles to push back on those behaviors in order to show how this behavior is truly vile and illegitimate. Would that be sufficient? No. It also needed the perfect example of the Prophet to enact that in every single day of life, every single conversation, in order to push back on those behaviors, to demonstrate a different behavior, until eventually, after months and years of relentless responding to those behaviors, would those behaviors finally be uprooted from their behavior once and for all. This is very important to understand, because sometimes in our own communities there are cultural challenges. And sometimes within our states and within our nations, there are certain challenges. There are overarching cultures and behaviors. When we talk about Islam being a genuine moral force on society, it needs to be a collective push and a relentless behavior in changing those bad behaviors. Otherwise, nothing will actually change. Otherwise, those cultures become too deep-rooted, and simply just talking about it will not actually change it. There needs to be ongoing emphasis, behavioral change, practical things to help us in order to be able to make deep-rooted cultural changes within a community. Let me show you a few verses of the Holy Quran that gives us that picture of how many ayat were being revealed one after another to be able to change that particular behavior. Please open your Qur'ans to Surah At-Takwir, chapter number, who can remind us which chapter number? Ahsant. If in case anyone hasn't got it, please open Surah At-Takwir, chapter number 81 of the Holy Quran, verse number 8 and 9. The first social policy that Islam created was defending the rights of those young children that were being buried alive and killed because they were thought of as a burden to the family unit. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَإِذَا الْمَوْءُودَةُ سُئِلَتْ. And when the infant, the female infant buried alive is asked, بِأَيِّ ذَنْبٍ قُتِلَتْ. For what reason, what sin was she killed? This was an intervention on the practices, the criminal behaviors of female infanticide. Before then, the Arabs had not been challenged on this behavior. It required the Quran to intervene, and not just to do it once, but to do it time and time and time again. In a couple of different ayat of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals different verses. For example, He mentions, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَلَا تَقْتَلُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ خَشْيَةً إِمْلَاقٍ نَحْنُ نَرْزُقُكُمْ وَإِيَّاهُمْ. Once Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't kill your children out of poverty. In another He says, don't kill your children out of a fear of poverty. We sustain you, we will sustain them as well. Tell me something, O men. Do you not have a full belly? Are you fed well? Where did that rizq come from? Was it from you or from Allah? It's from Allah. Your whole life, God gave you food. God gave you clothes. God gave you water. God gave you an animal to ride on. God gave you breath in your lungs. What makes you think that the same God will not give that to your children? So don't kill them out of a fear of poverty. The fact that you have been sustained, نَحْنُ نَرْزُقُكُمْ وَإِيَّاهُمْ. We will also sustain your children as well. Now this was huge for the Arabs. This was a logic that's so simple to me and you, so obvious, so blatant, so badihi, but they had not even bothered to think about it. Why? Because their cultures were so prevalent, so overwhelming, that it was not even within their capacity to think. I've been sustained all my life. What makes you think that my daughter will not be sustained as well? When these verses were revealed, it shocked them to the core. It opened up a level of logic that previously they had not even bothered to imagine for themselves. Ayah after ayah after ayah is revealed in order to be able to shake them from their bad behaviors. One more. Turn in your Qur'ans to Surah Al-Fajr. Which chapter number is Surah Al-Fajr? Ahsant, 89. And which verses did we ask you to open? Verses number 17 onwards. Jazakumullah khair. Everybody has it in their Qur'ans on their phones? Should I wait? Or everybody has it? You have it? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Kalla bal la tukrimun al yatim. وَلَا تَحَاضُّونَ عَلَى طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ وَتَأْكُلُونَ التُّرَاثَ أَكْلًا لَمًّا وَتُحِبُّونَ الْمَالَ حُبًّا جَمًّا. Look at another cultural practice of the Arabs at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What did they do? They used to, because of the number of constant wars and killings, and not being a healthy society that lived long, often, very often, there were many orphans that were created within that society. So the uncle would take over wilaya and guardianship of them, and what would happen? There was a systematic practice amongst them that they would usurp the rightful wealth of their own orphans that they were supposed to be looking after. Can you see? So if I died and left an orphan behind and someone else from the family took over and I had left the inheritance to my own daughter or to my own son, that would end up in the pocket of those who were looking after the children. This wasn't a one-off. This was systematic abuse of the wealth that was actually meant to be for the orphans. Now again, think about this. Your prophet, your Quran did not stand for this injustice. And it intervened, and it spoke, and it stopped it, and it revealed verses and practices and behaviors and demanded the change of the people until they realized the logic, they realized what their behaviors were doing to make a corrosive society, and eventually those behaviors were rooted out one by one by one. This is the sunnah of Islam and the Holy Prophet Muhammadin al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. So what do you think would be the sunnah of your fourth Imam, Zainul Abidin salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi? When corruptions came to Islam, when Banu Umayyah were in power, amongst the things that they wanted to do was that they wanted to reinstill a class system that meant that non-Arabs were second-class citizens, that slaves and servants were second-class citizens, because if they were able to reinstitutionalize a class system, then they themselves in Banu Umayyah would always remain at the top of that class system. You understand? You know better than me that in some countries, class systems are deeply rooted within society. In India, there's a class system. In Britain, there is a class system. And it is almost impossible to be able to break out of those things. Why? Because the people themselves perpetuate it. So long as they continue to consider that there is such a thing as a class system or races, then they continue to perpetuate those ideas. But someone along the lines has to come and introduce that. The fact that the Prophet and the Quran had managed to break those systems and unite a Muslim ummah looking beyond the ideas of tribal systems, looking beyond the idea of white and black. Islam had achieved this in the 23 years of the Prophet. Verse after verse after verse were revealed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, He wants nations and tribes to be able to get to know one another. Or He'll say, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. Or innamal mu'minuna ikhwa. Ayah after ayah after ayah, making sure that there is the principle of equality between human beings and to rid us of the notion of race, rid us of the notion of class. Banu Umayyah wanted to reinstitutionalize these practices and behaviors. Why? So that it would be beneficial to their own pockets, to their own power. If the people believe that there is a class system, that free man is better than slave, that Arab is better than non-Arab, then once that is reborn into the minds of an ummah, then they can always place themselves at the top of the perch, irrespective of whether they are in position or khilafat. Banu Umayyah will always remain at the top of the tree. From the time of Banu Umayyah, and particularly in the period of the fourth Imam, Banu Umayyah tried to reinstitutionalize these particular practices. There's a book of history that I'm going to quote to you one or two lines from that gives you an example of what they were like in the time of Banu Umayyah, trying to be able to reinstitutionalize these terrible behaviors of racism and extremism and classism between themselves. And understand that if Imam Sajjad alayhi salam had not opposed this, this would have been normalized back within society at that time. وَكَانَ بَعْضُ الْعَرَبِ إِذَا مَرَّتْ بِهِ جَنَازَةٌ قَالَ مَنْ هَذَا. Some of the Arabs, if they went past, if they happened to be present at a janazah, they would say, "Man hadha?" Who is this mayyit? Who is this person who has died? فَإِذَا قَالُوا قَرَشِيٌّ. If they said that this was someone from the Quraysh, قَالَ وَا قَوْمَا. They would cry out, "Ah, poor the Quraysh, so sad that they lost one of their own." وَإِذَا قَالُوا عَرَبِي. And if someone responded by saying this was an Arabi, then they would say, wa baldatah. And oh, our nation, in our land, in our community has lost someone. وَإِذَا قَالُوا مَوْلَاهُ. But if they said it was a servant, a slave man, an ordinary person, قَالَ هُوَ مَالَ اللَّهِ يَأْخُذُ مَا يَشَاءُ وَيَدْعُ مَا يَشَاءُ. Allah takes what He wants and gives what He wants. Meaning what? It's no loss. Allah takes what He wants, it's okay. No respect, no understanding, no care. But to reinstitutionalize the idea of divide. Why? Because by now you should all be very, very aware that what happens after divide comes? Conquer. By now the Muslims should be most aware of this. Why are the Muslims so weak? How many different nation states have we been divided into instead of what the Quran demands from us? Inna hadhihi ummatakum ummatan. What is it? Wahida. Where does Allah give us legitimacy for all these nonsense nation states? What is this thing called Saudi Arabia? La'natullahi alayhim ajma'in. There's no such thing. They have no authority. They have no place. What is this thing that these countries, and then we wave our flags thinking that there's some legitimacy to these people? There is no legitimacy whatsoever to these people. Think about it very carefully. The difference between what the Quran and the Sunnah is versus what we have become today. We can't even get a bottle of water into Gaza. 2.2 million people starving to death, eating the fodder of animals. We can't even get medicine into it. How is it that 2.5 billion people have become so weak? Banu Umayyah understood better then. If we divide you, we will conquer you. If we start making Arab versus non-Arab, slave versus free person, man versus woman, rich versus poor, if we can separate you and make you against one another, if we can make you as rivals of one another, like you were in the period of Jahiliyyah, then we will completely be able to dominate over you. And they tried this time and time and time again. I'll read to you a hadith about our fourth Imam, Zainul Abidin, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi. This hadith is mentioned in Al-Kafi. Hadith is as follows. كان لعبد الملك ابن مروان عين. Abdul Malik ibn Marwan used to have a spy in the city of Medina al-Munawwara that used to write regularly about what the people of Medina were doing. And an event took place وإن علي ibn al-Hussain عليه السلام أعتق جارية له ثم تزوجها. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam freed a slave from amongst his community and then married her. And so the spy wrote this and sent this as a letter to Marwan, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. In this letter, Abdul Malik wrote the following: أما بعد فقد بلغني تزويجك مولاتك وقد علمت أنه كان في أكفائك من قريش من تجمد بها في السحر. He actually wrote to Imam Sajjad alayhi salam and complained that Imam Sajjad alayhi salam was marrying someone from outside of Banu Hashim. Why? This is a slave. This is someone lower than you in standing. Think about this very carefully. Imagine in a country with millions of people where the president or the prime minister would write a letter to someone and saying, I don't approve of your marriage because you married someone in a lower class than you. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam responded and wrote his own letter back. And he mentioned in this letter as an example that when it comes to all of the majd, all of the honor, all of the pride that comes to Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, their example must be taken from the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alih. He writes back in this letter, فهمت كتابك ولنا أسوة برسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله فقد زوج زينب بنت عمته زيدا مولاه وتزوج مولاه صفية بنت حي بن أخطب. He said the example is that of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He is the best of example. And yes, from time he did marry from amongst his own tribe. He married, for example, Zainab, the daughter of his own uncle. And this was someone from Banu Hashim. But at the same time, he also married Safiya, who was not from his own community. Are we Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam better, or is the Sunnah of the Prophet better? Meaning that Imam Sajjad alayhi salam understood the games that Banu Umayyah were playing, and when they tried to normalize the idea that you can't even marry outside of Banu Hashim, or you can't marry from someone in a different class to you, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam responded and said, this is unacceptable in the school of Islam. And our fourth Imam alayhi salam pushed back upon the breeding of that notion back into the Muslim Ummah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. In another hadith, again to understand how Imam alayhi salam tried to be able to stop those practices from coming in and those behaviors being normalized back within the Muslim community. Another hadith about our fourth Imam, Zainul Abidin, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. Hadith is as follows. كان علي بن الحسين عليهما السلام إذا دخل شهر رمضان لا يضرب عبدا له ولا أمة وكان إذا أذنب العبد والأمة يكتب عنده أذنب فلان أذنبت فلانة يوم كذا. When Shahr Ramadan started, he would make sure that he would not discipline any of his servants from amongst the male and the female. And if any of his servants actually made an error, he would write it down. He would write down that on this day, this servant made this error. On this day, this servant made this error. حتى إذا كان آخر ليلة من شهر رمضان دعاهم وجمعهم حوله. When it came to the last night of Shahr Ramadan, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam gathered all of those servants around him. ثم أظهر الكتاب, and then he presented the kitab of their deeds back to them, and he would say, Ya fulan, فعلت كذا وكذا, you did this particular thing on this day, ولم أؤدبك, and I did not hold you to account or discipline it for you. Is this true? Did you do this? And they would say, yes, indeed, we did do this. And then the Imam, after taking them one by one and saying, did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? Imam alayhi salam would tell them, repeat after me. And then they would all have to repeat after him these words. And he would tell them, oh Allah, you watched my deeds more closely than even how I would watch the deeds of my servants in the house. Oh Allah, for me to be forgiven, I need to first forgive the servants of my house. Therefore, let me forgive the servants of my house, and therefore, oh Allah, forgive me for the things that I have done. Can you imagine? Now, the point I make to you is, if there was going to be this idea of treating servants badly, making them second-class citizens, third-class citizens within the ummah, how could Imam Sajjad alayhi salam make sure he held himself to account to the same way he held others to account? And if he wanted forgiveness and change for himself, he had to be able to institutionalize that within his own household. This was the sunnah of your fourth Imam, Zainul Abidin, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi. On another occasion, our fourth Imam alayhi salam gathered all the female servants of the house. The Imam had a practice. The Imam would purchase servants and he would teach them and train them and either offer them, if they want freedom, they could have it, or if they want marriage to Imam, they could have it as well. According to one narration, once a year, the Imam would gather those servants in the house and he would sit with one of the family members, the female family members in the house, and say to them, if anyone wants freedom, tell me. If anyone needs investment, support, tell me. If anyone wants marriage, tell me. And if you are too shy to tell me directly, here is a female family member of mine whom you can speak to and who can then relay it back to me. The point I make to you is, if you've got Banu Umayyah trying to institutionalize the idea of a classist system and racism within the community for the purposes of divide and conquer, the sunnah of Islam is this: that you actually have to not only push back on it, but be relentless in pushing back in it. You have to make sure that you understand it, and then actually in your own thinking and in your own behaviors, be an example that stops those things from happening so that it doesn't overtake the society, doesn't overtake the ummah itself. Now think about this very carefully. What might you think are some of the challenges in our own ummah and in our own societies and in our own communities? Give me some examples. Faizan, give me something, any challenge that you think needs to be pushed back against. He doesn't know I'm asking this question, huh? This is completely off the cuff for him. Say again? Involvement from the youth. So what would a sunnah be where it has to be relentless in order to be able to push back on that and make sure we have that? More opportunities? Just one-off opportunities? What's the sunnah of the Quran and the Prophet? Continuous, systematic, in order to be able to respond back to those challenges. What would be a different challenge within society that you might say is present? Racism. Do you accept that there is racism within the communities? Yes or no? Yes or no? Yes. I remember our brother, do you know Sheikh Noor from Birmingham? Do you know him? Yeah? A couple of years back, might have been 2019, 2020, he went on Ahlul Bayt TV and he made a comment about the extent of the racism that he experiences within our communities. And it caused a big conversation in London. We're not racist. So we started talking through it. And I remember a conversation, this is me having a conversation with one brother in the community. I said, okay, let's say there was someone from the Somalian community or the black African community wanted to marry your daughter or marry your niece. Would you marry them too? No, absolutely I would not. But I'm not racist. No, you are. No, you are. If there was a problem at that time, the Quran revealed ayah after ayah. The sunnah of the Prophet was to have an example whereby it manifested the response in so many different ways that people understood by their own existence, their own participation, the way in which people ought to be able to act. And over a period of years and even decades, those behaviors were changed one by one by one. If you want to make any change within your communities, whatever it may be, it cannot be simply as an ointment that is put on once in a year. This is what we've reduced ourselves to. We imagine that if Maulana comes and he says something from the pulpit, it actually removes the problem. It doesn't. We have our youth, there are challenges with addiction. We have our youth, there are challenges with this. There are people, challenges with that. Sisters with challenges like this. If you want to be able to remove a problem from your communities or societies, it needs to be a genuine plan of understanding where that problem has come in from, where it has started, how it manifests itself, and actually what systematic plan of action there will be in order to be able to change that behavior within a society. This is something that we've lost. We've lost that sunnah of the Quran and the Prophet, the sunnah of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, and the way in which they used to do this. One last hadith of our fourth Imam, Zainul Abidin, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi. Look at the way in which he tries to reinstitutionalize the love and equality between people at that time. Banu Umayyah are seeking drastically to break it. Imam alayhi salam said the following: نظر المؤمن في وجه أخيه المؤمن للمودة والمحبة له عبادة. Just the gaze of a faithful, of a mu'min towards the face of his brother, for the sake of his love and affection, is ibadah. Whilst Banu Umayyah wanted to reinstitutionalize classisms, extremisms, racisms, divisions, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam is doing the opposite and saying, even just a gaze in the direction of your brother with love is ibadah in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Look at the difference. The sunnah of the fourth Imam was relentless in stopping Banu Umayyah, in bringing the ummah back to the period of Jahiliyyah. According to one narration, our fourth Imam alayhi salam was in the city of Medina al-Munawwarah, and he'd already begun institutionalizing the majlis of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. According to one narration, Imam had the sunnah of inviting people for lunch at his house. This is mentioned within the books of Ahadith. Imam would invite people regularly, daily, for lunch at his house. And this was an opportunity to be able to tell them about the massacre of Kerbala, about the torture of the Sabaya in Kufa and Sham. It is said that one of the companions came to Imam Sajjad alayhi salam and said to him, Ya ibn Rasulillah, my son is getting married. I would like that you attend the Aqdun Nikah ceremony in order to be able to bless this marriage with your presence. Imam alayhi salam asked to be excused from this. He said, no, it is a day of gham. This is a time in which we are still remembering what happened to us in Kerbala. Please excuse me from this. But the man continued to insist and said, no, you are my Imam, you must be there. The Imam eventually succumbed to the request and said, my condition for coming is that you have someone recite the poetry and the gham of my brother Aliyun al-Akbar. And so the Imam attends, and the poet stands up and begins to recite the maqtal of Aliyun al-Akbar. And you remember when Aliyun al-Akbar is fighting so bravely on the battlefield. But due to the heat and the thirst that was overcoming him, he had to take off that chainmail that was surrounding his body to keep him protected. The enemy of God had turned to his own companions of Yazid's army and said, I will make Hussein weep for this child. They said, what do you have to do with this young man? Leave him alone. He said, no, I want to see Hussein weep for him. And so one of the cowards hid behind one of the trees in the plains of Kerbala. As Aliyun al-Akbar is fighting, this man comes from behind the tree and thrusts a spearhead deep into the chest of Aliyun al-Akbar. He lifts him in the air and throws him towards the floor. In Medina, that gham was being recited in front of Imam Sajjad. Imagine him having to listen to the maqtal of his own brother Aliyun al-Akbar. The poets say that the Shia who had invited Imam to this gathering looked up and could not see Imam Sajjad alayhi salam in that gathering. He gets up and he walks around and he finds that Imam Sajjad is sitting outside the house where the shoes are kept. He sits down, he says, Ya ibn Rasulillah, why did you leave? You asked us to have a poet recite the gham of your brother. He is reciting, why did you leave? Imam said that when the maqtal of my brother was being recited, Fatima al-Zahra came from Baqi and she sat down here outside. She is sitting here by the shoes. How can Ali ibn al-Hussein be inside the house while Fatima is commemorating the martyrdom of her grandson Ali al-Akbar outside? ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا